Hello everyone, in today's video I'll show you my Sony ZV-E10 S-Log2 color grading process from start to finish. But first let me show you my S-Log2 settings and exposure method. I use picture profile 7, gamma is set to S-Log2, color mode is set to ITU 709 matrix. I'm using ITU 709 matrix and not S-Gamma 3 Cine because S-Gamma 3 Cine is too demanding for 8-bit Sony cameras. Shooting in ITU 709 matrix gives much cleaner results. Kella Pike from DSLR Video Shooter made a great video about this topic. I'm going to leave it up here. Last setting that I change is detail. I set mine to -7. As for exposure, I always overexpose my image by 1 or 2 stops to get the least amount of noise in the shadows. Then in post-production, I bring down the exposure to the correct level. Since I'm not using an external monitor, I heavily rely on multimetering and zebras for exposure. When I expose for skin, I make sure that zebras cover the majority of the highlight part of the face, and I use the following zebra IRE values: 72 IRE for 2 stop overexposure, 61 IRE for 1 stop overexposure, and 50 IRE for correct exposure. If I want to expose for the sky, I set the zebras to 95 IRE and adjust the exposure until the zebras are completely gone. And if I want to expose for shadows in the jungle, for example, I'll use multimetering and make sure it's somewhere between +1.7 and +2. Now with all this out of the way, let me get on my computer and show you my S-Log2 color grading process. Alright, so I'm now inside Final Cut Pro and I have here 2 clips on the timeline from the Sony ZV-E10 shot in S-Log2, and I'm going to color grade these clips from start to finish. Let's start with this one. First thing I'm going to do is add some contrast. I'm going to do that with color curves, and I'm going to create a nice contrast with an S curve. First, I'm going to push down the shadows just slightly. Then I'm going to bring up the midtones highlights in here. And also I'm going to bring down the blacks and bring down the whites for a nicer highlight roll-off. And I think also I'm going to add another point in the midtones and play around with these points until I am satisfied with the results. So I think I'm pretty happy with how this looks. This is before and this is after. Next thing I'm going to do is add some sharpness with the sharpen tool because I reduced the sharpness in camera. But I am going to change it from 2.5 to 1.2, 1.3. Next, I think I'm going to correct the white balance. I think this shot looks a bit too green, so I'm going to add some magenta, just slightly, maybe like 3 on the magenta slider. And also I am going to add some yellow in this shot, maybe like 5300. And I think also, let's see if I can reduce the exposure in the midtones a bit. So again, this is before and after. All right, next I'm going to add hue saturation curves, and I'm going to push around the greens, yellows, and also the blues. So first thing I'm going to do is push the greens towards yellow orange just a little bit because this is 8-bit footage from the Sony ZV-E10 and you don't want to push the colors too much because it can fall apart. And also I think I'm going to decrease the saturation of these colors a bit, and with the blues I am going to push them towards magenta. I think I'm gonna go for a vintage look with this shot. I'm also going to desaturate the blues just slightly and also decrease the luminance of the blues just a bit, not too much, because look what happens when you push around the image too much with 8-bit footage. It falls apart. Just do a little bit, little minor steps, and it goes a long way. Same thing I'm gonna do with the greens, just to add a bit more pop and contrast. And I don't like this purple magenta in here in the shadows in the trees, so let me see if I can select these colors and slightly desaturate them. I mean, change the hues and also select them and desaturate these colors. And I think now the image looks a bit more balanced. And also I'm going to desaturate the shadows just to make the blacks appear more black. And also I'm gonna add another point just to make the transition a bit more gradual. This is before This is after. Minor difference, but now the shot looks a bit more balanced with the colors and with the saturation and also with the luminance. Honestly, in some cases I would use this shot as is, but I can take some extra steps to make it look even more unique and special. So I can go two ways with this shot. One is to push everything towards warmer colors like oranges and reds, and the second one is a bit more moody with like teals and blues in the shadows and mid-tones. Let's do both actually. First, copy this clip to do two different grades. I'm gonna add color wheels. Let's push the shadows towards orange red just a little bit, and also the mid-tones I'm gonna push quite heavily towards orange red, almost like magenta red, just to give this image a bit more of a vintage vibe, so to speak. And the highlights I'm going to push towards red as well, red, orange. This is before, a bit more moody, a bit more blue, and now it looks a bit more vintagey. Looks like it was shot in the 90s or something like that. But I can do further adjustments with color curves, and I'm gonna play around with the reds, greens and blues. So first thing, I want to remove slightly the reds in the shadows, just a bit. So it was here somewhere, and now I'm gonna push it towards green just slightly. And maybe with the greens I'm gonna add a bit more purple-like color. And maybe in the highlights I'm gonna push the highlights towards yellow a bit more. Let's see in the shadows what I can do with the blues. And honestly, I think I'm done. I'm gonna leave it as is, because the more you play, the more you get confused with color grading. So this is how we started, and this is the end result. Quite big of a difference. So first thing I did is I applied some contrast with color curves, then I added some sharpness, then I adjusted the white balance and also reduced the exposure in the mid-tones a bit. Then I played around with the hue saturation curves just to make all the colors a bit more muted and balanced. I basically pushed the greens and yellows towards orange, and then I pushed the hues here in the purple magenta and also the blues towards purple, something like that. Reduce the saturation in the greens, in the blues, and heavily in the magenta purple. And also I slightly decreased the luminance in the greens, blues, magentas, and purples. And I also decreased the saturation in the shadows just to make the shadows appear more black. Next, I pushed the shadows, mid-tones, and highlights towards warmer colors just to give this image a more of a vintagey, warm vibe. And finally, with color curves, I basically balanced the image to make it look a bit more balanced than before, because before it was just one color basically everywhere, and with color curves it looks a bit more balanced. We see some purple, like blue in the shadows, some yellow in the highlights, and in the mid-tones it's pretty much the same as the shadows. Now this is the same shot, but I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm gonna go for a very moody and cold look. So I'm gonna add color wheels. I'm gonna push the shadows towards teal. I'm gonna push the mid-tones towards blue teal. And I'm gonna push the highlights towards green yellow. This is before and after, just a minor difference really. Now I'm gonna add color curves and I'm gonna do some final adjustments to make the image a bit more balanced. So first I'm gonna play with the blues in the shadows and in the highlights, and let's play around with the greens as well, with the reds too. I think I'm going to add some yellow in the mid-tones. And I'm gonna come back to the color wheels and I'm gonna do some final tweaks and adjustments. Another thing I'm going to do is play around with the hues of the greens just to see if I can make it look a bit more moody. So this is how this shot looks like, and this is how this shot looks like. The grade is totally different. Now let's move on to this shot, and all I'm going to do honestly is copy the grade from this, because I think it's gonna work well on this shot, and just paste it here. And boom, this looks fantastic, but of course I can do some final adjustments. First, I want to add a bit more teal in the shadows. Let's play around with the reds, remove the reds and the shadows a bit, just to add a bit more teal in here. Let's play around with the greens. And now with the highlights, let's add a bit more yellow. Okay, now I'm gonna come back to the color wheels. Let's move the shadows a bit more towards red, the midtones towards orange, and the highlights, yeah, more towards orange red. Another thing I can do maybe is play around with the hue saturation curves. Let me play with the oranges here, make the oranges a bit more, exaggerate the saturation in the oranges a bit more. I'm also gonna come back to the color curves and just play around with the exposure, add even more contrast to this shot, and I think I'm gonna leave it here. Looks amazing. And again, what I did here is added some contrast, then I added some sharpness, then adjusted the white balance. Let me see actually if I can change the white balance. Then next, I played around with the hue saturation curves. Then I pushed the image towards orange, red to make it more warm. And then I did some final adjustments with color curves. And I think now that I'm looking at it again, it's too red. So I'm gonna come back to the color wheels, just push everything a bit more towards yellow. Alright, so as you can see, there's a lot of things you can do in terms of color grading with the Sony ZV-E10, even though it doesn't shoot in 10-bit. I'm honestly really surprised with the results I get with this camera. When shooting in S-Log2 or when shooting without using any picture profile, it looks really fantastic, especially for the price. It looks awesome. And also I want to mention that I am by no means a professional colorist. Maybe if you really know what you're doing, you can get even more out of this camera, but I am really happy with the results I get from this camera. Also, I'm going to create LUTs for the Sony ZV-E10. I'm going to leave a link down below for you to check out. And if you have any tips in terms of color grading or anything really, let me know down below. And I guess I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Peace.